good morning and welcome to Christ Table. My name is Kevin Young. I have the privilege of being lead clergy here at Christ Table. So glad that you're here with us this morning. If you'd like to know more about Christ Table, you can visit the URL that's right there, www.christstable.today. There you're going to find information about everything going on around Christ Table, and would encourage you to sign up for the email list there so that you will be aware of everything that's happening around Christ Table. One thing that I want to make sure that you're aware of, in addition to that, is this study's curriculum is available absolutely free. If you go to the URL that's right there in front of me, go.christstable.today/divinecomedy, then you can download a free PDF that has everyday study in here, along with some background information that will help you go deeper into the context of what we're talking about, as well as several discussion questions for you to work through to help you dig into the topic and see how it might apply more deeply or more appropriate or more appropriately or more directly to you. I'm a little tongue-tied this morning. I guess it may be because it's the last Bible study of the week, and the weekend is almost here. If you're watching this live or close to the time that it airs, then it's big weekend, right? Time change weekend where we lose an hour. Is that the following? I don't even know. See, who knows what's going on. But I'm glad that you are here with us for this study. One other thing that I want to make sure that you are aware of is this book. If you're struggling with your faith, know somebody who's struggling with their faith, or where to go from here, or if they even want to go from where they are in their faith to somewhere else, this book is a phenomenal resource. You can find out more information about it on that URL, drkevinyoung.com. Take a look at that, and if it's helpful to you, we'd love to get it to you. And if it has been helpful to you, if you've read it, I want to encourage you to please, if you've not already done so, go to Amazon, go to Barnes & Noble, write a review so that other people will hear your experiences about it. And writing reviews helps get it into the hands of other people as well. So in this study, Divine Comedy, we are looking into the Gospels at the teachings and conversations and actions of Jesus to see where he utilized wit, humor, sarcasm, comedy in order to get his point across. And he did it a lot. We just oftentimes don't see it because a lot ends up being lost in translation. Here, Matthew chapter 19, verses 23 to 25, we find a conversation that involves a candle and the eye of a needle, which many of us, even if we have a very tacit or distant relationship with the text of the Bible, will have heard of, because this is one of those things that's become a colloquialism or an idiom that now enjoys a fair amount of usage outside of religious circles, an axiom that many people will utilize in order to make a point. So why don't we go ahead and jump directly into that text, and then we'll talk a little bit about it and then send us on our way for the rest of today. So find ourselves again in Matthew chapter 19, verses 23 through 25, where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, I tell you the truth, it is very hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he's going to tell us exactly how hard it is. I'll say it again. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. The disciples were astounded. Then who in the world can be saved? So Jesus is talking here about the kingdom. He is talking about how to get into the kingdom. And he says that it's very difficult for a rich person to get into the kingdom of heaven. Then he says, let me say this again. Let me do an echo, but I'm going to echo those words of how difficult it is by using a different means of conversation. And so let me give you an illustration in order to say the same thing, but in a different way. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. And the disciples' mouths drop, and then they say, well then, and let's just go ahead and go back and see exactly that last paragraph. The disciples were astounded, then who in the world can be saved? And their response actually tells us a little something about what Jesus is saying here. So let me start here and say that the eye of the needle, and then we see actually that verse that's there in a different way. Again, I say to you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And perhaps you've heard this explained, that there is, or was at least in Jerusalem, an entrance into the city, and Jerusalem was a walled city. It had only a certain number of entrances or gates around it, but there was an entrance to the city that was called the Needle, or the Eye of the Needle, and that was the way in which camels entered into the city. And so when a camel needed to come in and out of the city, that it would have to essentially get down and scratch on its knees, like shimmy through this. And there are different versions of it. Some of the versions are like this, that indicate that it was a door that they had to go through, a smaller door that they could barely fit through, or that it was essentially just a hole or a cutout in the wall that a camel would have to like dip down and go under, almost like underneath the wall, in order to get in. And this story has really gained a lot of prevalence over the years. I know that I have heard it in sermon after sermon after sermon, in order to say a rich person can get into the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God. This is what Jesus is saying, but it's not easy. It takes a little bit of work. You've got to be humble. You've got to, kind of bow yourself down in order to get in. And there's this whole just word picture that's painted around this idea that is completely and utterly false. That's fabricated. In fact, if you go online and do just a very small amount of Googling, you'll actually be able to find references to this and people who have traced it back to its very first occurrence, the very first person who said it. Nobody can find any reference to it in any historical book, any place, anywhere, other than a few decades or maybe 100, 200 years ago. And before then, there's nothing about it. Many of the walls are still standing in Jerusalem from the old times. And it's just not, it's completely and utterly a fabricated story. There is not a reference to a narrow gate in Jerusalem called the Needle's Eye in this passage. That's not at all what's going on here. Whenever Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, he's not talking about it's easier for a camel, to go through this gate that's made for camels, but they can't get through easily, than it is for a rich person to get into the kingdom of God. No, he's talking about a needle and the eye of a needle, which they had in those days. They had linens, they had clothes, they had needles, they were able to sew. And so this is something that everybody would have understood, an instrument or a tool that everybody would have had with them or near them, very accessible. There weren't sewing machines, so they used needles. And so what have we done? Well, we have completely concocted this story in order to make it easier for people to avoid what Jesus said. What did Jesus say? Well, Jesus gives this illustration that people would have laughed at the image of a camel trying to get through the eye of a needle. It's impossible, right? I mean, it's impossible for this large beast of burden, a camel. It's going to be easier for a camel to fit itself through, thinking specks and planks, right? Gnats. And what was the gnat? Let me go back and look. It was a gnat and it was a camel. See, it was a camel again. Ha! First day of the day. I was like, that doesn't make sense. We're talking about camels again. Apparently, Jesus liked camels. Well, why did he like camels? It was because something that everybody knew, because they were around everywhere all the time. And they were huge. They relied upon camels. And so Jesus is like, it's easier for one of those huge animals to get through an eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom of God, which is why there in that text, in the last verse, the disciples were astounded that who in the world can be saved? Because they understood that he was talking about a needle and that this is an impossibility, right? And that is, in short, what Jesus is saying here through a laughable scenario of a camel trying to get through the eye of a needle. It's impossible. It's impossible for a rich person to enter into the kingdom of God. And we have several stories of rich people having conversations with Jesus, and one of them in particular, the rich young ruler, has done everything and is a model citizen, is a model religious person, has done an extraordinary number of things, and his resume is absolutely incredible. And he says, what do I have to do to get in? And Jesus says, sell everything. You can be rich. Divest yourself of everything that you have. And that's the one thing that he couldn't do. And I think that this is what the disciples are thinking as well, because they were thinking that's the one thing that we wouldn't be able to do either. We don't know anybody who would be willing or crazy enough to take away all of that safety and to take away all of that security in exchange for, and Jesus is like, in exchange for what? What are they exchanging safety and security for? Safety and security. The kingdom of God. Trading the lesser for the greater. But in order to accept and hold on to the greater, Jesus says you have to let go of the lesser first. No one gets into the kingdom of God with fists. You come into the kingdom of God open-handed and upturned or downturned. Nobody comes in with anything in their hands. And so the folks who are hearing this in one moment are laughing at the ridiculousness, extremes in the analogy. And yet then in the next breath, as often happens with Jesus, they're laughing in one moment and then reflecting in the next moment and saying, is he talking about me? How do I fit into this? Because I worry that I do. And this is really what happens with Jesus. The idea of wit and wisdom with Jesus really are two sides of the same coin. And that Jesus will oftentimes utilize humor in order to teach. Will use wit in order to come into the back door of our minds or into our hearts with wisdom. If Jesus would have just immediately said, hey, rich people aren't going to get into the kingdom of God. People, whoa, wait, no. They wouldn't have thought of themselves there. But he got them laughing. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to get in. So you're telling me there's a chance, but it's pretty much an impossibility. Oh, I was laughing, but now I'm thinking, was he talking about me? Is it me? Is it I, Lord? And this is the brilliance of Jesus' divine comedy. Because in the midst of being guarded, having dropped our guard, being unguarded, we are for a moment in an unguarded state because of humor, able to do self-assessment that we would not otherwise be able to do because we were caught off guard. So Jesus oftentimes uses humor in order to disarm, in order to make something sink in or allow something to sink in that would not otherwise sink in. And what is that thing? Well, here, the disciples understood what he was trying to say. The impossibility for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. So, define rich person. How would you define a rich person? And I think that that is probably the start of the conversation to get us to the answers of what it means to be in the kingdom of God and whether or not we're headed towards it or away from it. Well, it's been good to be with you today and this week. If you'd like more information on this study or that downloadable free resource, you can go to that URL, go.christstable.today/divinecomedy. Looking forward to being with you next week as we continue on the study. Until that time, happy reading.